So I want to welcome Yomara Velez, who's with the National Domestic Workers Alliance. But I think the hat that she's wearing for a while now is going to be to focus on what's happened in Puerto Rico with Hurricane Maria. So could you just start by giving us a little background about yourself and what the work that you do and your connection to the island?
Sure. So I actually spent my childhood on the island. My family moved here back to the mainland when my dad lost his job, and we moved. We actually spent a year living in Puerto Rico when he was looking for work. We lived with my aunt and my uncle, and he just wasn't able to find work, so we came to the mainland. And I was just like in elementary school when I came to the mainland. And a lot of our family is still there. My aunt is still there, and a lot of cousins. So my connection to the island runs very, very deeply. And obviously I'm very, very concerned about the situation in Puerto Rico. I have been able to get in touch with some of my cousins, which I was very happy that we were able to connect. And one of my aunts, after a week, we were able to get in touch. However, we still have a lot of relatives that we still haven't been able to get in touch with. Our relatives that live in Adjuntas, which is a mountain town, we haven't been able to get in touch with. And my relatives also that live in Guayanilla, we have not been able to get in touch with. So when I spoke to my aunt, she said that the situation in Puerto Rico right now obviously is it's just dire. There's no other way to explain it. And a lot of my cousins don't have access to water currently. Supplies are running really short. None of them had power as of a couple of days ago. And she's been able to drive some of my cousins to her house so they can shower and just, have some access to water. But she is also a doctor and she's working like double shifts, and she told me it's really, really difficult to access gas, and so she hasn't been able to pick them up as of recently. So yeah, I jumped a little ahead, but that I feel very, very connected to the island. And I became an organizer early on here. I started organizing in the South Bronx around housing and welfare reform issues, economic justice issues. And I also became very involved in the fight to remove the Navy from Vieques, which is a small island that was used for many, many years as target practice by the U.S. military. So we were very involved in those organizing efforts. We had a group called Sisters de la Lucha back then, based out of the Bronx in East Harlem. And I've been organizing pretty much ever since. So yeah, so now with everything that's happening, there's a dire need for Boricuas to, really take on leadership and step it up and do something for the island.
Can you say a little about the Puerto Rican community in Atlanta, how big it is, or what you've learned about it maybe since this has happened?
Sure. So I feel like the Puerto Rican community in Atlanta has grown a lot, and I think part of that is that before Hurricane Maria hit the island, Puerto Rico was already facing a humanitarian crisis due to a financial situation in Puerto Rico. So we've seen a huge exodus of hundreds and hundreds of Puerto Ricans having to leave the island. Throughout history, right? In different periods of history, we've seen huge exodus. My grandfather, my grandmother, my own family when I was younger, and now the most recent exodus, where I feel like it's mostly concentrated in Orlando, Florida, but I think increasingly more Boricuas are coming here to Georgia, and I think it has grown significantly from when I first moved to Georgia, a decade ago now. So I think most of the Boricua community is in Gwinnett and like further north of the city. And I've been connecting with the Boricua community here because of the efforts to collect materials and supplies for relief for Puerto Rico. It seems like, the Boricua community here, just like everywhere else, is super passionate, super involved, and really active. And so we've seen lots of different drop-off points that have been organized by local Boricua business owners. We've seen all sorts of different efforts and pages, like on social media developed. So I feel like hopefully, it's not East Harlem in terms of like how big of a community we had in New York, but I think it's definitely growing.
Can I ask and interrupt and ask a question? So you're using a term for Puerto Rico. There might be some of our listeners that are saying, what did she just say? What's that?
Yes. So Boricua is also another term for Puerto Rico, and that's grounded in our indigenous roots of the Taínos. So Boricua is Puerto Rican.
Okay.
Would you spell it for folk?
Sure, it's Boricua.
Okay.
There we go.
So back to kind of the overview of the situation now. Can you kind of just list maybe some of the major problems? I know I've seen a lot about hospitals that not as many that need to be or functioning, and what's happening with seniors and children.
Yes. So there's a real huge issue with hospitals running on generators. I think now they've tried to get diesel fuel to as many as they can, but generators were running really low on fuel. A lot of the aid has also centralized itself in San Juan, and so a lot of the smaller towns and municipalities that are outside of the metropolitan area have not necessarily been reached the way they need to be reached. And so a lot of folks are having issues with medication, so not being able to refill their medication.
And insulin, I saw, which has to be refrigerated.
Yeah. I have a friend who, her father hasn't had any electricity, hasn't been able to refrigerate his insulin. There's folks that, were scheduled to have medical procedures that were very urgent, and now those have been put on hold. Children have been out of school since Hurricane Irma hit, so schools have not reopened. About half of the gas stations remain closed. My cousin said that you easily can wait anywhere between 7 to 10 hours for fuel. ATM machines are not dispensing cash. Food is being rationed, but the lines at supermarkets that are open are really, really long. There's also an issue of people are not able to get to work, and so they are going to be spending the next week or two without any pay. Banks have agreed to allow people to hold their mortgage and car payments for 3 months, but it's not clear if at the end of those 3 months they'll just start on a new monthly cycle, or if they're going to be required to pay the the amount that they owe. And that is really scary, right? Because if people are expected to pay a bulk amount on their mortgage and they haven't been paid for a few weeks, then we're going into a situation where folks can be foreclosed on. So there's a lot of uncertainty on the island right now, and it's just like flights out. The airport has been packed, so a lot of those folks who have immediate needs haven't been able to necessarily have those addressed.
So we were talking earlier about the history. Can you talk about the relationship between the austerity measures that have been going on, and so the impact on the infrastructure, so that when this happens, it's that much harder to rebound?
Exactly. I mean, the austerity measures that have been put on the island are horrific and have required for the Puerto Rican government to really put the debt over people for a long time, right? And so all the infrastructure in Puerto Rico, the roads and that sort of thing, was not being maintained on a regular basis the way it should have been. And so now that the hurricane hit, you're seeing a lot more roads and bridges just not being able to hold up to the storm because of the lack of maintenance. So it's a huge issue. I think the colonial relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States, and I'll say this because I know a lot of people here in the United States don't necessarily know the history of Puerto Rico. I heard like only half knew that we were U.S. citizens. And that citizenship has come at a very high price for us Boricuas. And in the early 1800s, Puerto Rico has been colonized for centuries now. Spain was colonizer for about 400 years. And we had just won our independence when the United States came onto the island and invaded the island and never left. And so we've had a colonial relationship with the United States ever since. And interestingly enough, there was a hurricane that happened in the early 1900s in Puerto Rico, which was a very intense storm. And over 3,000 people died during that storm. And the United States never sent relief to the Puerto Rican people post that storm. And what they ended up doing instead was that they devalued our currency. And so at that time it was the peso, and they devalued it by like 40% or something like that. So for every dollar you now had 60 cents. And when you put that together with the fact that the hurricane had destroyed our coffee fincas, which are like our small, coffee, they were quite plantations because they're very, very small, but it destroyed a lot of the crops in the agricultural sector, and people were forced to then take out loans at extremely high interest rates. And so post that hurricane, you saw a huge land grab where people took out these loans to sustain at a huge interest rate and then weren't able to maintain payments. And so their land and their homes were foreclosed on. So, if you go from there all the way to the Jones Act, the fact that there were ships from Cuba and from Venezuela ready to provide assistance to the Puerto Rican people. And because of the Jones Act, there's only two ways you can get into Puerto Rico. You either have to pay, all this money to get your merchandise in, or you have to reroute, go to Jacksonville, Florida, and then come to Puerto Rico. And the fact that, that process wasn't waived fast enough so that these ships could reach the people of Puerto Rico is really, really tragic, and has had a huge impact on how, the aid has not been able to get to Puerto Rico in a timely fashion. So, there's just all kinds of ways that the colonial relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico has impacted our inability to really self-govern.
So that was my next question about how you would evaluate the government's response so far relative to Katrina or any other disaster we've seen.
Yeah, I think the president's response to this crisis was an insult. It was an insult to any Boricua from the diaspora here. It was enraging. It's enraging to see that your people are facing these dire conditions, and here you have the President of the United States, who's supposed to be someone that, the people look to for leadership, just at his golf club, days and days passed before he had any sort of like high-level meeting with his cabinet, and then he's tweeting, about the NFL peaceful protest around police brutality and calling women of color the B word, and saying things like Puerto Ricans just, want things done for them, which is like a highly charged statement. I think it's easy to understand when we see the president's behavior that he's just completely underdeveloped and incapable of really leading during this time. And so we know as Boricuas and people who are progressive that the president is not going to be able to offer the type of leadership that we really need. And so I would prefer to really focus on the love that I have for my people and for my community, and the power that we have to organize and to take action and to just, just continue to push forward relief efforts from our end.
And you probably didn't hear, I did a little story report about the AFL-CIO here sending a plane load of skilled workers, electricians, medical staff, carpenters, heavy equipment operators, truck drivers, etc., from all the unions here in the United States this coming Wednesday. And I wanted to ask for your opinion as well. Puerto Rico has had some of the strongest unions in regard to the electrical workers, teachers, who have really stepped forward and pushed back against these austerity measures, who really have acted on behalf of the population as well as working people's living standards. And I was wondering if you could make any comment now about the relationship between organized groups on the island, whether it's unions, whether it's student groups, whether it's any other kind of civic organizations, political parties, etc., from what you might know about how they have been able to self-organize.
Yeah, I mean, I think based on what I'm hearing, a lot of the relief efforts have been self-organized by the people in Puerto Rico. You know, truck drivers there on the island making themselves available to work and distribute goods. And there's been a lot of like cleanup and opening of roads that the people themselves have self-organized to actually clean up and open up. And we actually heard from one of our volunteers on the ground that one of the airports was actually completely in Aguadilla was reopened based on the efforts of local folks coming in and really getting it ready so that flights could come in, and that the airport had been open since September 22nd, and they kept begging and asking, can you please, like, you know, route planes this way because, you know, we're ready, we have fuel, we can provide fuel for the plane to fly out. And yet, you know, whoever is coordinating logistics there, whether it's, you know, FEMA or the governor of Puerto Rico or together, there just wasn't any action on that. And, you know, as of a few days, they still weren't flying planes into that airport. And so I feel like the Puerto Rican people are resilient people. They are ready to take, you know, the rebuilding of the island on, you know, and they are motivated. Somehow the way that these logistics have worked out on the island, I feel like it has really limited the ability for people to really have the mobility that they need to get the aid out and to get to those areas that are really remote. Even when people are saying, you know, we're ready, even when there's like, you know, groups of people who are volunteering and providing their time, there just hasn't been that connection. And I heard this morning, like, you know, a news report where it's beginning to happen, but it has happened. I mean, we're going on to 2 weeks since the hurricane hit the island. And the fact that I still haven't talked to some of my relatives is just insane to me, you know, especially, you know, a country like the United States that has operated in much more difficult terrains and has, you know, taken on all kinds of missions and accomplished them. I just don't understand how it is that Puerto Rico has, you know, they haven't been able to have the capacity to distribute the relief that needs to be distributed.
It's one of the things you obviously think about. My understanding is that these ships, like these hospital ships, still hadn't left as of, I don't know, yesterday or even maybe even today, so that they could have been off the coast where people who needed those emergency surgeries or needed medications that had to be refrigerated or whatever could have been there. And now I know President Trump said that island is in the middle of a big, big, big ocean. But again, we have to wonder about when a storm of the ferocity that Maria was known to be, and that it was going to be a direct hit on the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, hitting many other islands as well, but really concentrating its fury there, that there can't be advanced preparation to get the things so that the minute it's gone, off goes the hospital ships, off goes.
And that ship itself, if I'll add, actually took, I don't know how many hundreds of people had to sign a petition in order to get that dispatch. I don't know how many hundreds of people had to sign a petition to get the waiver on the Jones Act, and then we only got 10 days when it can easily take 5 days for a ship to get to Puerto Rico. So we're talking about, like, it's outrageous. Like, I can't even begin to understand like why it's taking that much organizing and mobilizing for like the most minimum response from our government.
Can I make a suggestion? Let's talk about this. One of the things that obviously happened after New Orleans is potentially happening in Houston is the actual deliberate destruction of areas where poor and people of color communities lived, with the idea that many of them are sometimes very close to the downtown areas, and that this so-called redevelopment that happens afterwards brings in a whole different demographic, raises the prices on everything, and changes the character of the city to one of a developer's paradise. So what I'm wondering is, in your mind, Paul referenced that this is going to be a real move to try to privatize the electrical system, the grid. It's going to get rebuilt, but then like who's going to own it and control it? So I'd be interested if you want to comment a little bit about maybe some of this is has another goal in mind besides rescuing the people of Puerto Rico and letting them stay there, but actually, is it helpful to move people to the United States as another form of cheap labor? Is there something else going on?
Yeah, and we were already seeing that in Puerto Rico. We were already seeing a lot of just foreigners coming into the island and buying property right after the financial situation got the way that it got. Property values decreased, and there has been increasingly a steady flow of people coming into the island and people leaving. And I think that is a super important point right now after the hurricane, because so many other people are going to be forced to leave. And a lot of folks on the island didn't have home insurance, or car insurance. So for some folks who lost everything, they truly did lose, like everything in there is going to be very little resources available for them to rebuild their lives. So our organizing efforts need to really be focused on how we're able to keep folks in place if possible. And then if it's not possible and they have to evacuate to the United States, how to make sure that people are able to go home. That's going to be really, really, really important. Also, right away we saw the vultures come in and offer more loans for Puerto Rico to sustain. It's the most ridiculous thing ever, right? So really we need to push for the debt to be absolved and for no more loans to be, put on the Puerto Rican people, because this is not the time for that, and it's just not sustainable development. Also FEMA, the president waived the cost sharing for FEMA, but only, I believe it's already expired, and we need to make sure that the FEMA cost share is waived indefinitely, because the reality is that Puerto Rico is just not in a situation where we can expect for it to pay for its own relief right now.
So I know we only may have a few minutes. Could you talk about what people can do locally, and in two parts, in terms of immediate relief and strategy around long-term, some of this policy stuff? Mm-hmm. And the meeting this morning, if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, so we've started meeting with some of our local congressmen, representatives. We feel like it's really important to educate our representatives about Puerto Rico, about the history of Puerto Rico, and to really uplift that there is a Puerto Rican community here in Georgia, that we are organizing ourselves and we're paying attention, and we want them to vote on policies that are going to support Puerto Rico rebuilding in a sustainable way. So our first meeting was this morning with Hank Johnson. The meeting went really well. We were only able, obviously, to meet with his staff person because they're in session, but we plan to meet with him in person in a couple weeks when he comes home. And we talked a lot. We kind of divided it in three categories. One is making sure that the current relief efforts are managed in a much more effective way. We want to make sure that all of these donations that are being collected can get to the people in Puerto Rico. And he actually sits on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, so we want to make sure that he represents the voice of his constituents in that committee, and so that these relief efforts, all the bureaucracy that has surrounded these efforts, can be undone and people can actually get the help that they need. The second piece was really looking at the Jones Act, asking them to waive it for a longer period of time to really allow ships to dock in Puerto Rico and give people what they need. It's obvious that we need a relief package, right? And that should be equitable to what other states have received for Irma, right, and other hurricanes that have happened recently. And this discussion that this relief package is not going to go in front of the Congress until like, a week from now is ridiculous. So we want to make sure that that gets moved, sooner, that it happens sooner because, it's time is of the essence. We also know that some of the people who do leave the island might end up here in Georgia. We are already seeing folks come into Georgia. One restaurant owner was saying that he had 25 applications from Puerto Ricans that had recently arrived here in Georgia due to the storm. So we want to make sure that those communities that are coming, those people that are coming to our community have the language access and, the resources and orientation necessary for them to be here, but then also that they have the support necessary so that they can go home. So those are some of the things we talked about. They were really supportive. We'll have to see how things play out and what actions they take. We will be trying to meet with all of our congressmen and some of the other elected officials. So that's one strategy that's happening. A lot of Puerto Rican business owners have been really, really busy and active. Buen Provecho, Porch Light, I believe, is one of them. There's just a group of them. They've been collecting, relief for Puerto Rico, and they're working to try to get those goods to the people of Puerto Rico. So that's another effort that people can support. I know that there's a press conference coming up with the mayor of Atlanta. I think there needs to be a series of meetings with the city of Atlanta to figure out what the city of Atlanta can do. Local government can do a lot. We've seen in New York, the governor went to Puerto Rico and has offered a lot of support. So we want to make sure that our state and our cities are also leading in these efforts. And then, there's the longer struggle around the debt and, the colonial relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States and, with Promesa and La Junta, this like nationally, federally appointed board to oversee all of Puerto Rico's finances and just overall, governing Puerto Rico basically. There has to be a strategy around that. And this is a wonderful opportunity to really promote community ownership, to invest in, cooperatives and to learn about land trusts and to figure out how we provide Puerto Ricans the tools necessary to develop in a way that is sustainable but also community owned.
So one last minute or two more. Is there, in your opinion, a website that isn't so necessarily just Atlanta focused or Georgia focused, but where people can get the real deal, not how it's filtered through mass media? And I was reading today's paper. There are thousands of people in Houston who are still in government-paid hotels. So, like, Houston and Harvey is off the radar now. We don't hear anything about it. And this is likely to happen eventually with Puerto Rico as well. In another few days, it won't even be covered. So people need to have enough, or maybe not.
Maybe today.
So people need to have another alternative source of media that is somewhat trustworthy.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if there's a website that somebody's put up, Puerto Rican News or something.
Yeah, I don't have all the names right now. I know that the Center for Puerto Rican Studies that comes out of Hunts Point has put together like a Rebuild Puerto Rico webpage that has a lot of resources. And maybe I can get some of those pages to you and you guys can link them to the show or to the website for WRFG so folks can access them. The Center for Investigative Journalism in Puerto Rico has been really active. They're the ones that broke some of the stories around the undercounting of deaths in Puerto Rico. So I would also encourage people to check out their webpage, and then we'll have more available that we can share with you.
And what about locally if people want to support or get involved? is there a phone number, website?
Yeah, I would give out my email address for now. We're still working on, like, I'm not a techie, so we don't have like a web page yet. But
Okay.
I'll give my email address if anyone is interested in volunteering or getting involved. Feel free to please reach out to me. My email is YOMARA, V as in Victor, ELEZ @gmail.com.
Okay.
I want to thank you so much. This has really been a very, I mean, it's such a sobering to look at the pictures and everything. I so appreciate all the time you have given both us here at WRG to keep us updated and all the work that you and so many others have been doing